Underwater. Yeah, and the canals. Oh, yeah, the one at Johnson Lake. Yeah, South Alexa. We were both. Very advisory. In fact, very early. Did you ride your bike?
I could have.
Very active. You got with her.
Tomorrow I have 2 crowds. But I don't think I'll ride my bike. You know, it's supposed to be like 72. I could ride it. I don't know.
You ride a lot?
I do. It's usually just in, the morning.
All he has is a bike in the group. John Killer's in charge of it.
Oh, we're streaming.
John's really into it. He's contact information. Yeah. Like John, he'll give it to you. Okay, John Keller. There you go.
You'll probably go too fast.
I wouldn't be surprised.
You'll probably go too fast. I have one of those. Just one speed.
That's very good. We are live. We're going whenever you're ready. We have 17. So used to spend quite a bit of time on the Bopac Trail. I was riding one time, and there was a helicopter on top. It was kind of a canopy of trees. Vivid imagination. I do very myself. Maybe Vietcong or something in my bicycle. And there's the U.S. Forces looking for me. But you keep crossing roads. And at the next road, the bicyclists have been hit by a car. And that's where the helicopter was coming out.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 41st Annual Winter Lecture Series, Global Perspectives. This year's topic, as I think you know, is America First, Then and Now. My name is Peter Levitoff, and I'm the chair of the Planning Committee. Other members of the committee are Dick Deanspear, Sharad Sait, Chuck Francis, Barb Francis, Parks Coble, Amira Ibrahim Pasic, and Priscilla Handy. Jason Slaughter will be our technical expert today, and he'll be overseeing the technical aspects of the program, including both on-site here and Zoom delivery. And for those people who are Zooming now or who may be here and plan to Zoom in the future, we're using the same Zoom link for all 4 lectures. We're also looking to add a few members to the Planning Committee, which is presently dominated by us octogenarians, so we can always use some youth on the committee. And if any of you might be interested, you're not, without making a commitment, just find one of us at the intermission after the lecture. This year, we've modified the format after switching to remote or Zoom delivery with the advent of COVID several years ago. So it'll be presented in what we call hybrid format, which means both on-site and via, not Zoom, but via YouTube. In addition, we've changed the time from the evening. It had always been at 7 p.m. on Sunday evenings to the afternoon, with the expectation or hope that more folks will find it possible to drive to the church both ways while it's still daylight. Furthermore, this year, there's an odd quirk in the schedule that there'll be a hiatus in the middle of the series. That is, that we'll have the lecture this week and then next week at the same time, and then we're taking a week off on Sunday, February 22nd, because the church is going to be used for another purpose, and then we'll resume for the subsequent 2 weeks, which is March 1st and March 8th. I hope this doesn't throw anybody off, and I'll mention it again next week. The Winter Lecture Series was originally housed in the Vine Congregational Church here in Lincoln, but the sponsorship switched a couple of decades ago to the Social Action Committee of the Unitarian Church of Lincoln. The church is also providing modest refreshments between the lecture and the question and answer session that follows. The series is brought to you with financial support of Humanities Nebraska, which is a statewide nonprofit organization helping Nebraskans explore what connects us and what makes us human. Additional support has been provided by the National Nebraska Cultural Endowment. We also partner with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, familiarly known as OLLI, which aids with publicity to its 1,800 members. And I did say 1,800 in Lincoln. Most of the members of the Planning Committee are also OLLI members. We promise to conclude the program at 4:30 Central Time, which is 90 minutes after we begin. I say Central Time because I think we have a couple of people watching us remotely from other states and other parts of the country. But don't worry, nobody will miss the opening kickoff of the Super Bowl, which is scheduled at 5:30 here. Unless you're a very slow driver, you can get home. The 2026 Winter Lecture Series is focused on America First, a political and social movement that began almost a century ago and was prominent in the years just before and after World War II. It advocated isolationism, along with anti-Semitism and anti-foreign sentiments. As we've seen more recently, it has reemerged and morphed into nativism, prioritizing those born in the United States, especially white Christians, and opposing the entry into the country of the foreign-born, particularly from black and brown nations. We'll open the series this week with a historical overview, then move next week to an economic perspective, notably the application of tariffs and trade policy to support the domestic agenda. The third lecture, on March 1st, will examine leading social issues stemming from the America First doctrine, with particular emphasis on immigration and deportation. And the final lecture will address foreign policy, both historical and contemporary, and will touch on isolationism today, unilateralism, and the American stance toward Israel. As you think of questions or comments, if you're present on site, please wait until after the break. And if you're watching remotely, please type your thoughts into the chat function, and Jason Slaughter will moderate the chat and read the questions and comments posed. Finally, if you miss a lecture, each will be posted within a week on the Unitarian Church YouTube channel. And it was in the website, but I'll just repeat it now, www.youtube.com/ and this is all one word without any punctuation or spaces, Unitarian Church of Lincoln. So youtube.com/ Unitarian Church of Lincoln. If you're on site, please mute your cell phones. You don't want to be embarrassed. If you're attending remotely, please mute your audio and strike your video to maximize the bandwidth for our program. And now on with the show. Our first speaker will be introduced by Dr. Parks Coble, Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Nebraska and a member of the Planning Committee. So Parks, it's up to you.
Well, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Sean Trundle. Sean received his PhD in American Studies at the University of Hawaii in 2013, and his dissertation was Studies at, Scientist, State Policy, and Popular Imagination since 1945, and I've heard some papers from that are very interesting. When he came to Lincoln, he was tasked with several things. One was to develop some exciting new classes to sort of energize our history major, which he did. Among those was one particularly intriguing called History of the Present, which is you take a contemporary issue and then you examine it in historical perspective, which you might note is what we're doing here with our lectures on Trump's America First policy. He also was tasked with digital, being a digital historian, and he developed a couple of interesting classes. I am sure they're interesting. I wish I had a chance to take some of them. One called Digital America, which looks at the enormous impact digital developments have had, and the other is Being Human in the Digital Age. Sean was also asked to facilitate digital technology by students and faculty, introducing this through courses and workshops. And he was put to the test when the COVID crisis occurred. I vividly remember in the middle of the spring semester getting the email or the directive from the administration that we would have 2 weeks for spring break, and that when we returned, all in-person classes were canceled and we would have to go in a digital format. And for some old geezer professors like myself that had never done any online teaching, this was quite a shock. And Sean was thrown into action organizing a series of sort of emergency workshops and helped us all get through it. And this continued actually through the summer or next fall as well. So he came to the rescue. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Sean Trundle.
Well, thank you, everyone. Particularly, I'd like to start by thanking the committee for the invitation, and Parks for that kind introduction, and also for all of you for being here today. I heard there's some kind of sporting event this afternoon. I know probably many of you could be at neighborhood parties or family gatherings, and so I appreciate that you've taken the time to be here with us instead. And the same for the folks online. It also happens to be a strangely beautiful day in Lincoln for February, so to be willing to come inside for an hour and a half or so, I appreciate that. So I was asked to start off this winter lecture series to give a historical overview of the kind of concept or the sort of political notion of America First. And the bulk of my comments today are going to focus on the America First Committee, a short-lived political action committee in modern terms in the immediate run-up to World War II. But I'll start off here with a kind of overview of this concept in general. It is in fact more than a century old, not to contradict our introduction here. Before I get into the rest of it, though, I will just explain this opening image. If you can't see it, or I don't know how legible it is to folks, as I'll talk about in a little bit, from the very moment that the America First Committee was created, it started receiving plenty of criticism, including from a young man named Dr. Seuss, which is the cartoon you see on the screen here, who is a vocal critic of America First throughout its duration. The cartoon, if you can't see it, and I'm going to have trouble reading the text verbatim here, but it's a woman reading a storybook to two children. She appears to be pleased, happy, smiling, and the children appear shocked or terrified. And the book is called Adolf the Wolf. There's a swastika on the cover. She has a shirt that says America First. And she says, don't worry about this because these are foreign children. And her glee, her words suggest indifference, but the glee on her face suggests she's actually happy that these foreign children are suffering at the hands of some foreign enemy. This neatly ties together some of the kind of central concerns about the America First Committee, including its relationship to Nazi Germany, notions that it was an anti-Semitic committee, and this kind of indifference to the war in Europe. All right, let's see if I can get this to work. Maybe.
Just a moment. Try it again.
There we go. All right, so when I first began the research on this project, as with all kind of historical investigations, I wanted to see what other historians had to say about this subject already, what we call the historiography. And what immediately jumped out to me is that there's this consistent theme in the coverage of America First, which is that America First died the day of Pearl Harbor. Just to give you two examples here from some early historical coverage of the America First Committee. One from, it's actually from a textbook, The Diplomatic History of the U.S. I think it's from the 4th edition in 1950. The author, Thomas Bailey, says, America First died the day of Pearl Harbor. The next example is from Wayne Cole, 3 years later in 1953. I believe he wrote the first full-length text on the America First Committee. And he expresses a similar sentiment, but with more colorful language about the slaughtered corpse of America Firstism. And I'm going to start at the end here with this notion that America First is dead, because obviously we're here in this room because it has not died. These kinds of sentiments, this notion of America First, has of course continued into the present. We're here today because America First has become a major slogan of Donald Trump, beginning with his 2016 campaign. Both officially and unofficially, as a kind of campaign slogan. He's used it alongside other phrases like Make America Great Again. But then also, as I'm sure we'll hear about next week, even his official policy, his executive orders, bills coming through Congress. His economic policy was called the America First economic policy when he's putting tariffs into place. So with all due credit to those earlier historians, it appears the announcements of the death of America First were premature. And if it was just Donald Trump, I think we could excuse those historians. Donald Trump is certainly a sui generis event, a kind of unpredictable thing in American history. Even in 2016, as he's running for office, most American media, the political pundits, et cetera, are not only saying that he will lose the election, but that he represents this kind of dead or dying era of American politics. But of course, it's not just Donald Trump. In fact, if you Google America First today, or look it up on YouTube or something like that, you're much more likely, maybe, to come into contact with this guy, Nick Fuentes, a far-right influencer, commentator, live streamer. You can give him whatever job title you'd like. But he is a proponent of white supremacy, of Christian nationalism, and in fact, kind of a right-wing critic of Donald Trump, to Donald Trump's right. Likewise, Donald Trump, despite some claims to the contrary that I'll take a look at in a moment, was not the first post-war politician to use the phrase America First. It was notably used in George Wallace's 1968 campaign and for Pat Buchanan in both 1992 and 1996. It was his campaign slogan. So again, this is not just a question of Donald Trump, right? This theme seems to come back in American history consistently. And so to ask why those early historians may have been wrong about its premature death, I think one place to start is by looking at the long-running history predating the American First Committee in the United States to figure out why it has had such longevity. Now, the first instance of the use of the phrase America First associated with organized politics in the United States that I could find is through the American Party, or what we colloquially call the Know-Nothings, or the Know-Nothing Party, in the run-up to the Civil War. This was a nativist party whose primary organizing principle was anti-immigration. And they used the phrase America First in several campaigns throughout the 1850s. And if you're not familiar with the Know-Nothings, that's okay. I also slept through antebellum U.S. history, so that's fine. But this is one of the major third parties of the 19th century, and in fact, during a kind of brief period in the immediate run-up to the Civil War, looked like it might become one of the two dominant parties. And again, this is based entirely on this anti-immigrant sentiment of the period. As Donald Trump was using the phrase in 2016, many of his critics were keen to point out that the phrase has a long association with racist and white supremacist groups in the United States, including by the Ku Klux Klan, particularly during what's called the Second Klan. This is kind of the rebirth of the KKK in the 1920s and 30s, who would regularly hold America First rallies and often used a slogan, a kind of longer version of the slogan, America First, Last, and Always, or America First, Last, and Forever. Likewise, it's been associated with more mainstream politicians, again, even before Donald Trump, including several presidential campaigns. So, for example, Woodrow Wilson used the slogan America First in his 1916 campaign for president. And if you're a big Wilson head, I don't know if there's anyone in the room who's like a giant fan of Woodrow Wilson, this may not be surprising to you. But if you have a passing familiarity with Woodrow Wilson, this might be a little surprising because we tend to think of Woodrow Wilson as the great internationalist, right? The man who wanted to create the League of Nations, these international diplomatic bodies to avoid war in the future. And yet here he's using the slogan associated with, again, xenophobia, white supremacy, and particularly with isolationism in the modern era. But I'll call your attention to the date. This is Wilson's 1916 campaign. And just to put this in context, World War I breaks out in Europe in 1914. The U.S. does not enter the war until 1917, and so this is in that interim period. And as Wilson is running for president, he is touting his achievements in, quote-unquote, keeping America out of the war, keeping America free of these foreign entanglements, particularly these European entanglements. So even Wilson, the great internationalist, here is using the phrase with these isolationist overtones to highlight, again, his ability in keeping America out of the war in Europe. Likewise, this is a more minor note in American political history, but I think it taps into one of the key themes in the way that this phrase has been used over time. The slogan was used by Big Bill Thompson, running for mayor in Chicago in 1927, running for re-election, I should say. Sorry, I'm getting a little feedback there. Running for re-election in 1927 on the Republican ticket, who also used the phrase America First. And for him and his supporters, this was particularly tied to the idea that the Chicago school system was teaching anti-American ideas. And this is kind of a weird note in American history, but basically the accusation was that the way they taught the American Revolution was too favorable to the British, and so it was teaching anti-American values. And I think if you pay attention to the way that Trump and the kind of surrounding MAGA world have talked about not just schools, but museums and national parks, and the notion that they're being taught some kind of corrupted version of American history that's undermining American values, you might see the kind of resonance with this moment here. Also probably worth saying, he was the last Republican mayor of Chicago, and also happened to be a good friend of Al Capone's, who we've heard Trump say some favorable things about in the past, although I'm not sure how strong the connection is there. In any case, in this kind of big historical overview, we can see some key themes emerge in how this term has been used consistently. First of all, again, going back to the Know Nothing Party, there's this long-standing association with nativism and xenophobia, fear of foreigners and immigrants. Secondly, the attachment to white Christian supremacy, and here I might add, to that discussion of the Second Klan period. It's worth noting I want to be very careful in how I say this. It is certainly the case that the Klan in the 1920s and 30s was still overtly racist against African Americans, but it's also the case that the bulk of their activities were actually focused on anti-Semitic and anti-Catholic messaging in the period. There's a strong notion of kind of white Christian Protestantism driving the movement at that time. Isolationism, of course, has been a kind of key recurring theme, although we're going to unpack exactly what that means here in just a few moments. And then finally, this kind of cultural paranoia, right? The sense that the elites, the media, the press, teachers, educators, the culture industries, film, etc., are promoting anti-American messaging and corrupting the minds of the youth. But I do want to pause here for just 1 second and be really careful with how we think about this term operating. And what I really want to highlight for you, well, actually, let me go ahead and advance. I'm going to draw on another quote from the president here. And this comes from a kind of internecine fight in MAGA world last year over the question of Israel. As Donald Trump was supporting Israel, some of his far-right supporters, again associated with that America First term, people like Nick Fuentes, people like Tucker Carlson, were starting to say Trump no longer represented America First because he had put Israel's interests above the United States. And Trump's reply was to say, I invented America First, so I get to decide what it means. Now, given the 170-year history we've just talked about, we're right to chuckle at the first half of that, right? But I think he's actually on to something when he says, I decide what it means. And so to unpack this a little bit, I'm not saying that he alone gets to decide what it means, but I think sometimes when we talk about America First and the history that it's had, we get roped into asking the wrong kinds of questions. When we look at something like the America First Committee, we ask, was it really an anti-Semitic organization that just happened to use non-intervention, staying out of World War II as cover for that? Or was it really a group of peaceniks or people that just didn't want to get involved in European wars that were too comfortable with anti-Semites? And again, I think that's just the wrong way to ask the question. Instead, what I would suggest is that the reason this term keeps popping up and circulating in American history is precisely because it's ambiguous. Precisely because it allows an audience to impart its own meaning onto the term. And so when you're speaking to a room full of moderate Republicans, America First can mean we're just spending too much money on foreign aid and we should be spending that money at home. And when you're speaking to a group like the Klan, it can mean there are too many people with brown skin or too many people who don't attend a Christian church, right? And it is precisely this flexibility that allows this concept, America First, to serve as a meeting point for these other oftentimes disparate groups to find common ground and take political action together. Okay, From there, we're going to move into looking specifically at the America First Committee and this kind of concrete manifestation in the run-up to World War II, which until 2016, if you had opened any history textbook or attended my freshman class on U.S. history, the only time you would hear the words America First were to describe the America First Committee. Maybe?
Just a moment. Go ahead.
All right, well, you can go ahead and advance it. Thanks. To describe the America First Committee. What is the America First Committee for folks that have heard of it before? Again, it was a fairly short-lived political pressure group. Again, what today we might call a political action committee. It formed in September 1940, and as I suggested before, it dissolved after Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, within about 4 days. So by December 11th, the committee had dissolved entirely. So just a little over a year in existence. Their singular focus, at least overtly or in terms of their official charter papers, was to resist American entry into the war in Europe, this developing war that we're now going to call World War II, and particularly to keep the neutrality statutes in place, which I'll talk about here in just a few moments. In that 1 year, again, even though they're short-lived, they had pretty explosive growth. They were able to build 450 local chapters. They had a coast-to-coast reach from Boston and New York out to California, to Seattle and to California, Los Angeles, San Francisco, all had chapters. And to generate nearly 1 million members, again, just in this 14-month period or so. One other kind of side note I'll just mention, I'm not going to spend too much time dwelling on this today, but since we are in Nebraska, I thought it's worth mentioning, it was a distinctly Midwestern organization. Again, it did have this coast-to-coast reach. It never had much of a hold in the U.S. South, but about 2/3 of its members were within 200 miles of Chicago. I think 105 out of those 450 chapters were in Illinois, right? So it did have this very distinct kind of Midwestern identity, even as it generated, again, this kind of coast-to-coast attention. Now, you might notice there that I have isolationist in what we call scare quotes, meaning I have some hesitancy about using this word. And so to explain the context of the America First Committee and also kind of their animating drive, we need to unpack that term a little bit and think about what it meant in the 1930s. And to do that, I'm going to draw on another quote from our dear leader, who, in 2016, when he first began using this phrase, America First, was approached by reporters and was asked, are you intentionally invoking the legacy of America First, the committee? Are you an isolationist? And Trump's reply was to say, I'm not an isolationist, but I do believe in America First. Now, I don't think Donald Trump knew he was doing this. I don't think he sits around reading academic literature, but he was actually wading in here to a long-standing terminological debate among historians, an argument about how we should describe this period. Because we do use this word isolationism. Again, you'll still find it in American history textbooks today, but it has a very specific context here. That is to say that the United States at no point, but certainly not in the 1920s or 30s, was not sealing off its borders like shogunate Japan. That's not what isolationism means here. This kind of describing people as isolationists in this period was actually born as a pejorative, as an insult, to suggest that people who took this position didn't care about world affairs, that they were narrow-minded and cut off. But it stuck, and so that's why historians still use it today, even if it's not a kind of capital I isolationism, right? So what were they actually trying to stay out of? Well, to answer that question, or what were isolationists actually advocating for? To answer that question, we're going to have to back up a little bit and go back to World War I, revisit our friend Woodrow Wilson, and think about the American experience during World War I and how that led to this long-standing isolationist movement across the 1920s and 30s. And the first thing to say here is just, again, the war breaks out in Europe in 1914. America doesn't enter until 1917. And in that 3-year period, the reason Wilson is touting his success in keeping America out of the war is because Americans were overwhelmingly opposed to joining World War I. We don't have great scientific polling from the era, so you can take this with a little bit of a grain of salt. I can't tell you exactly 84% of Americans were opposed to war or something like that. But if you look back at the literature of the day, it's clear that Americans were reading the news and aware of the horrors of the war in Europe, including horrific new weapons, chemical weapons, gas agents, nerve agents, this kind of stuff. Aware of the mass casualties, at a place like Verdun in France, you're looking at approximately 70,000 casualties, 70,000 fatalities a month for close to a year that this battle is running. 70,000, just to put that in context, that's the capacity roughly of Memorial Stadium at UNL. Every month, that many soldiers are being shipped in and killed. And again, Americans at home are reading about this, and it's clear that they don't want to take part in it, right? And they're making their voices heard, at the ballot box across the country. Of course, Wilson does enter the war in 1917 for a variety of reasons that are probably better suited to another lecture. And there is in response to wartime propaganda and maybe a kind of rally around the flag effect, there is a wave of support for World War I after America actually enters. But as the war winds down and the world enters a short-lived but critical global depression at the end of the war, there's a wave of mass migration, which upsets American politics. There is a massive backlash to Wilson at the end of the war. And the first place to see that political backlash is to note that, as I mentioned before, the League of Nations, again, Wilson's kind of brainchild, his vision for the world order in the future, to avoid future conflicts like this going forward, it does form, we get the League of Nations, but the United States is the sole Western industrial power to not join the League. And they don't join because Wilson can't get the support in Congress to ratify the treaty. And so immediately, within a matter of a year or two, there's a significant political backlash to participating in World War I. That message becomes even louder in the 1920 presidential elections when Wilson's successor Cox loses overwhelmingly to Republican Warren G. Harding. Warren G. Harding, who, in my opinion, there's all kinds of criticisms of Harding to make, but in my opinion here is rather clever to reuse Wilson's own slogan, America First, to highlight this idea that America had betrayed that commitment to neutrality and keeping America out of the war. Harding goes on to win the election with 60% of the popular vote, a landslide even for an era in which elections tended to have bigger swings between them. And so the lesson for a generation of American politicians coming into the 1920s is quite clear, that you should avoid these kinds of foreign entanglements going forward. And indeed, across the 1920s, there is this kind of withdrawal from international institutions. Likewise, in American popular culture over the 1920s and into the early 1930s, most discussions of war tend to emphasize its brutality and savagery, and also really critically, in works like A Farewell to Arms, its pointlessness, right? There's this sort of existential question about war, which is what have we fought it for, right? So again, there's this kind of generation of people having lived through this experience of World War I who are interested in restricting America's actions on the world stage. But why do I have this question mark? Why have I been insistent on these kind of caveats around what we mean by isolationism? Well, I do want to be clear, this is not cutting off American borders. American multinational corporations are going to continue to grow and spread their influence during this period. The American automobile manufacturing industry is going to explode across the 1920s. The steel industry is going to increase its exports. Likewise, there is no, it is not a suggestion that we can't use military force abroad. The U.S. through the 1920s and through the 1930s is going to continue its occupation of the Philippines. They're going to continue in what's called the Banana Wars, which date back to the turn of the century, these kinds of invasions of Latin American and South American countries and Caribbean countries, typically in response to a threat to American business interests, right? So again, it's not that the U.S. is going to cut itself off from the world, and it's certainly not an expression of pacifism, right? It's a very specific objection. When we talk about isolationism, it's a very specific objection to getting involved in these European affairs, right? A very specific objection to getting entangled in these alliances where the United States might end up fighting on behalf of British interests or French interests or Belgian interests instead of on our own. And in fact, this is true of the America First Committee, too. This is General Robert Wood. Apologies if you can't read the text. But Robert Wood was the first and only president of the America First Committee. And here he's responding to, he's at an America First rally, so he's speaking on behalf of the organization, and he's responding to questions and concerns that if the United States doesn't get involved in World War II, and if Britain should fall to Nazi Germany, won't it come to American shores next? And even if the US has a strong military and can fend off Adolf Hitler, won't our neighbors fall to Nazism? And Wood's response quite clearly, right, even though he will be called an isolationist, is not to say, we'll just shut our borders. He says, we'll send in the Marines. If an unfriendly government emerges in Mexico or in Panama, we will use force to displace that unfriendly government. So again, isolationism, I want to be very clear in this context, does not mean cutting oneself off from the world. It does not mean pacifism, right? It is just about this involvement in European affairs. And so to come back to where I started this discussion of isolationism, is Donald Trump an isolationist? Well, certainly not, if you mean if by that you mean he's going to, again, shut the borders entirely. He's used military force throughout the Middle East. Just a month ago, right, he deposed the leader of Venezuela. He's been involved in renegotiating these multilateral trade deals. So that's not what he means by isolationism. But if he means abandoning the defense of Europe, which is what it meant in the 1920s and 30s, well, I'll leave it up to your interpretation, but I'll just ask you to look at his record on Ukraine, and we're going to find a much more kind of mixed bag there. Okay. So, with that kind of understanding of this kind of strong impulse among the American public for keeping European conflicts at arm's length during this period, let's get into the meat of the matter and talk about the America First Committee itself. And to understand the America First Committee, you need to understand that they are responding to increasing American involvement in Europe, and what they're really looking to do is to preserve the letter and the spirit of these neutrality acts passed from 1935 to 1937. The neutrality acts were passed by the US Congress in response to increasing escalations in Europe. It was clear that war was on the horizon, or at least likely on the horizon. And so the US Congress, again, responding to this strong isolationist sentiment, passed a series of acts that restricted how the US could or should involve itself in those conflicts, particularly beginning with the first 1935 Neutrality Act. It banned the sale by private sellers, so by arms manufacturers, of arms to any so-called belligerent nation, although these are really, again, targeted at the a presumed European conflict down the road. It banned the government from distributing any military aid to a belligerent nation. It banned American ships from carrying arms or equipment, so even if you weren't selling them, you couldn't transport them to belligerent nations. And it banned banned arming civilian ships in the kind of convoy fashion that had been done during World War I. So again, sort of really trying to keep America out of any moves that might move more closely towards entering the war in Europe actively, or a presumed future war in Europe actively. However, so again, these neutrality acts are passed from 1935 to 1937, but of course, the situation in Europe continued to deteriorate, and more Americans, and particularly the Roosevelt administration, came to realize that there might need to be further U.S. action, and that these neutrality acts might be hamstringing the capability to respond should a full-scale war break out in Europe. And this would, of course, particularly escalate in 1939 with the Danzig crisis, and then eventually the invasion of Poland. So as they're moving to revise the neutrality statutes, again, to open up the possibility of some more direct support for the war, the Roosevelt administration and his political allies began a public campaign to loosen those restrictions on the neutrality acts. This took, all kinds of forms, including formal addresses from President Roosevelt and his fireside chats, talking about how the neutrality acts were crippling American ability to help its allies in Europe. Include the organization of political groups like the Committee to Defend America and its Allies, sort of the counterpart to the America First Committee, a civilian group that would lead public lectures, distribute flyers, etc., promoting more involvement in Europe. It also took the form of popular culture producers, films and television, comic book producers, what you see on the screen here, who began to present or to put a friendlier face on American involvement in Europe. In fact, this is one of my favorite primary sources to talk about with my freshmen. This is the first edition or the first issue of Captain America, I should say. And if you can't read the date at the bottom there says March 1941. This is actually a little bit of a quirk of the way comic book publishing works. It probably actually hit the newsstands in December of 1940, so about 4 months before that. They post-date them so they can keep them on the shelf longer and they still look new. And if you're not if dates aren't your thing, let me just point out December 1940 is a full year before Pearl Harbor. That is to say that Captain America here is declaring war on Germany a full year before America is, right? No surprise, maybe, if you consider who Jack Kirby and the kind of folks working in the comic book industry and where their political allegiances might lie. So again, there's this concerted effort to raise more support for America to enter the war in Europe, and as one might expect in this case, that sparks people to start to advocate that we should keep the neutrality statutes in place. That if someone's advocating to change them, of course their opponents are also going to organize political movements and groups to try to keep them in place. And initially, those efforts are, by the isolationist faction, the folks that want to keep the neutrality statutes in place, are very scattered. They take place across like a dozen different kind of political action committees, split along class lines and political lines. They also tend not to have a lot of institutional authority in 1937 or 38 or 39. What I mean by that is that like all the major publishers of the era, so the Hearst Empire, Henry Luce's Time Life magazines, the New York Times, these were all strongly interventionist publications, and they didn't have that kind of voice on the isolationist side. So again, initially that effort was pretty scattered and again split across a dozen or so organizations until 1940 when the America First Committee emerged. And really emerged in response to this transition or the revision of the Neutrality Acts to allow for what's called cash and carry aid. And if you could go ahead and advance the slide. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble there. Thank you. So in 1939, again, in response to the Danzig crisis and then the invasion of Poland, Roosevelt is able to get a revision to the Neutrality Acts, which allow for cash and carry aid. What that means is the U.S. can supply arms to Europe, provided that they're paid for in advance. That's the cash part, and that we don't ship them over there, right? They're not going on American ships. That's the carry part. So the British have to come pick up their own weapons. And again, it is in response to that revision to the Neutrality Acts that this America First Committee emerges. It begins actually as basically a student group at Yale Law, led by a guy named Robert Stewart Jr., who is he's an heir to the Quaker Oats fortune. A little bit of a historical tidbit there. And it was a Yale Law student, or I think actually a recent Yale Law grad at the time. It begins as the Defend America First Committee, and in the name there, the original argument from the student group was that Roosevelt keeps coming on broadcast radio and saying we need to build all these planes and build all these ships to defend American shores, and now he's selling them to Britain. Well, how are we going to defend ourselves, right? So that's where this name Defend America First comes from, right? That we shouldn't be shipping arms over there because we might be attacked ourselves in the future. The student group goes quickly, and it in fact includes several people who would go on to be really important political figures in the U.S., including Sergeant Shriver, future President Gerald Ford are all members of this student group. And they decide to expand their efforts beyond the Yale campus. One of their first moves when they decide to transition to being a general political action group is to recruit the president, Robert Wood, retired general. He had served in the occupation of the Philippines that I mentioned earlier. And he was the chairman of the Sears and Roebuck Corporation, a major American corporation of the era. With Wood on board, the committee was able to quickly attract a number of other high-profile individuals, particularly in the business world. The Sterling Morton of Morton Salt, Nobel Prize winners, even members of the Roosevelt family all joined the General Committee of the America First Committee. So kind of the advisory board overseeing their organization. This is how they're able to skyrocket to, again, nearly 1 million members in that one-year period, is because they're able to get immediate buy-in from these rather high-profile individuals. The organization, again, officially had a singular focus, which was on keeping America out of war. They said we have 4 basic principles, and as long as you agree to these principles, you can join the committee. It was not a partisan group. It was aimed at being a kind of centrist organization that could cross party lines, although it had some trouble doing that for reasons we'll get into in a few minutes. So they said we have 4 basic principles, and those principles, again, are that we need to prioritize the defense of the United States. We need to build a quote-unquote impregnable defense. So again, to keep those ships, planes, et cetera, back here in the U.S. That involving ourselves in the European war only places that defense in jeopardy, and that so-called aid short of war, the Roosevelt plan to continue supporting the British and to some extent the French and other belligerents in the conflict, or other participants in the conflict, I should say, only jeopardizes that defense and risks bringing America into the war. And so they said, again, as long as you agree with those 4 things, you can be a member of America First. And we don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican. We don't care if you're a Jew or a Christian. Again, as long as you support those central ideas, you are welcome to join us. With a couple of exceptions. And I think this is actually interesting enough to pause here for a minute to note. Again, Democrats, Republicans, all people of all religious faith are welcome to America First, except Nazis, fascists, and communists. And the reason I think this is worth pausing here for a moment to notice is that these folks were overwhelmingly anti-intervention. They were on the same page as America First. Communists, this is still in the era of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, this non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And so the Communist Party of the United States officially was a non-interventionist organization, an isolationist organization in the language of the era. Of course, fascists did not want the U.S. to enter the war on the side of Britain, right? They supported Nazi Germany. And so, again, they were on the same page as America First in terms of whether or not America should join the war. But the committee is saying you're not welcome here. And they're doing this precisely because they expect to be attacked as a pro-Nazi organization, and they want to preemptively defray some of those charges. Of course, it's not going to prevent people from making that allegation, and as I said way back at the beginning, from the very moment the America First Committee is born, they start getting that kind of criticism, the suggestion they are secretly fascists, that they support Nazi Germany, and all this rhetoric about defending America is just a distraction from that. This is one of the politer, more considerate, I guess I'll say, criticisms of the America First Committee from that period. It's also one of the better produced ones, and to be honest, I chose it because it was started by a Unitarian minister, and so I figured given our venue today, it was an appropriate one to look at. This pamphlet, broadside, was published by the Friends of Democracy, again started by a Unitarian minister based out of Kansas City, Missouri, in which he accuses the America First Committee not of being Nazis, and in fact he's going to go out of his way to say, look, I really believe that all of the people involved in this committee are true patriotic Americans who believe what they're saying, that they're not secretly Nazis, but if they get what they want, the Nazis will win. Right? So again, even if they don't mean to be doing this, they're ultimately promoting the same ends as Nazis. And this is pretty characteristic of the criticism of the committee in this early phase, where again, it's still arguing to kind of maintain the neutrality statutes. Again, the America First Committee was aware that these kinds of allegations would damage their reputation. Again, they did want to be perceived as sort of mainline American or I should say, in line with mainstream American politics. And so they did take considerable efforts to try to rebut those accusations. Throughout the tenure of the America First Committee, again, they maintained that ban on open fascists joining the organization. They probably would have maintained the open ban on communists too, but to be honest, it doesn't really come up. They never had much luck recruiting communists to join the organization. The CPUSA, Communist Party of the United States, considered them an imperialist organization and so told its members to stay away. But again, they did maintain this ban on allowing open fascists to join the organization. So if you were a member of a group like William Perry's Silver Shirts or the Silver Legion, a kind of openly fascist organization in the United States, they would strike you from their member rolls. Likewise, if you were a member of the German-American Alliance or the Bund, right, these kinds of overtly pro-Nazi organizations, they would remove you from the membership rolls. They even sent back donations if those donations were accompanied by a letter or statement that expressed any kind of sympathy or support for Nazis. And I want to be really clear about this as somebody that's worked on a couple of political campaigns. Getting in a political organization to send back donations, I'm not saying it represents a sincere belief, but it represents, a commitment to demonstrating something, right? So again, they did take significant efforts throughout their tenure to distance themselves from fascism and the allegations thereof. They also tried to rebut challenges of anti-Semitism, but here their record is quite a bit more muddied, to put it mildly, particularly by the end of the organization, which we'll get to in just a couple of minutes. Unlike that ban on fascism, there was no ban. You could be an open anti-Semite. In fact, there were many open anti-Semites, as I'll talk about in just a moment, and still join the organization, so there was no ban on membership. But officially, the organization would say, we are not anti-Semitic, and we don't support anti-Semitism in the United States. And again, to try to rebut those charges or kind of get ahead of those charges even early on in the tenure of the committee, Robert Wood reached out to his business partner, the president of Sears and Roebuck Corporation, Jay Rosenwald, to join as a member of the general committee of the organization, a prominent Jewish businessman, to signal that this is not an anti-Semitic organization. In fact, it's open to membership from Jewish Americans. However, this effort backfired, and it backfired quickly, because at the same time that he invited his business partner, he also invited Henry Ford to join the general committee. Henry Ford at this point was a well-known, highly visible anti-Semite. In the 1920s, he had published the Protocols of Elders of Zion, a kind of conspiracy theory tract, which advocated a lot of really vicious conspiracy theories about Jews and had also engaged in a number of other kind of anti-Semitic organizing campaigns throughout the 1920s. Because of this, there's a kind of immediate political backlash, that they're openly inviting this well-known anti-Semite to join the organization. And as a result, Jay Rosenwald actually steps off of the committee. And so, again, this initiative, which had been, Robert Wood had intended to say, hey, look, we're open to everyone, ends up sending the exact opposite signal. A very clear reading of the situation is maybe not that Jews are not welcome on the committee, but that they will not feel comfortable here, right? That you will be sitting next to Henry Ford and people of similar persuasions. So again, this effort that had started to signal an openness to Jewish membership ended up backfiring pretty quickly. As I hinted at a moment ago, the other kind of big issue around anti-Semitism for the committee is that a lot of their members were openly anti-Semitic, and there was no ban on being so. This is particularly visible in their overlap with the so-called Coughlinite movement. The Coughlinite movement, named after Reverend Charles Coughlin. If you're not familiar with him, he was a Catholic priest in the early 20th century who had developed a widespread following as a radio preacher, but in 1938 had basically been banned from the national airwaves due to a series of anti-Semitic tirades. Now, Coughlin himself, let me say, the committee was initially reluctant to invite him to join. They do eventually, by mid-1941, he'll become an official spokesperson. But the committee doesn't want to tie themselves to Coughlin, particularly because of this reputation as an anti-Semite, because of the thing they just went through with Henry Ford. They don't want to, double down on those problems. But most of their members, most of the members of the AFC were also Coughlinites. And you can see this in the correspondence between the local chapters and the national organization. The national organization is saying consistently, we need to distance ourselves from these guys. They're giving us a bad look. And the local chapters are saying, if we kick out the Coughlinites, there will be no one left, right? This is who our membership is. So we cannot exclude them. The response from the national chapter, that what you see on the screen here, is to say, well, if you can't kick them out, at least try to keep them at arm's length. Don't let them sell. Coughlin's, the name of his weekly, I don't know if it was weekly, the name of his newsletter is Social Justice. They say, don't let him sell social justice at your events. If you see somebody outside selling it, well, approach them and just explain the situation. They'll probably understand we're on the same side and this is a bad look for us, right? So again, there is this effort to kind of keep them at arm's length, but certainly not to condemn or disavow them. So, finally, that brings us to Lindbergh, the most famous member of the America First Committee and the one who would be responsible for sort of permanently tarring them with this label of anti-Semitism. Lindbergh, like Coughlin, the committee was initially reluctant to invite him to join. In the first few months of their organization, Lindbergh, also a controversial figure by 1940, he had accepted among other things, he had accepted a medal from Nazi Germany. He had refused to return it after the war broke out. And while he would sometimes speak critically of the Nazis, he would never quite disavow them or condemn them entirely. There's always these kinds of caveats and sort of partial acceptance or justification for what was going on. And so again, initially the committee, like Coughlin, was reluctant to invite him, but the problem they were facing was that Lindbergh was far and away the most popular isolationist speaker in the United States in the late 1930s into the 1940s. That is, he drew the biggest crowds, the most charismatic, the most well-known, and so at some point, by spring of 1941, the committee felt they had to reach out to him and invite him to join. And he did, and over the next few months, he gave a series of speeches on behalf of America First, encouraging support for maintaining the Neutrality Acts and staying out of the war. But in September 1941, September 11th, 1941, he gave a speech that would become quite infamous. It was actually the first time, again, he's giving several speeches over these months, but it was the first time that Lindbergh had directly attributed any kind of cause for the war to Jews, and it immediately generated a huge backlash in throughout the United States. I don't feel a strong desire to defend Charles Lindbergh here, but I do want to put his comments in context, so I will just point out when he begins the speech, he begins by noting that it's totally understandable why the British would be encouraging the U.S. getting more involved in World War II, and why Jews would be advocating for that. And he even goes on to say that what the Nazis are doing to Jews in Germany cannot be forgiven or condoned, and that it is in fact quite horrific. But that's where the decent parts of the speech end. And following from this, he goes on to first of all, repeat several anti-Semitic tropes, including, again, those kinds of things that were promoted by the Protocols of Elders of Zion. So suggesting that Jews secretly control the media, the government, the film industry, and again, that they're kind of polluting American culture and mindset against true American values or something to this effect. And then also, some of his comments that got the most backlash or when he goes on, he says, I totally understand why Jewish people would support America fighting Nazi Germany, but their reasons are not American reasons. And this statement might make a little bit of sense when applied to the British, right? You can say that, of course, the British want us to fight in World War II, but those are British problems, not American problems. But he goes to say the same thing about Jews, and the problem here is he's talking about Jewish Americans. And he's saying their reasons are not American reasons. And so very quickly, the public recognized that this is drawing a kind of fundamental opposition. It is saying Jews cannot be real Americans, right? That their reasons are not American reasons. As I suggested a moment ago, this speech immediately makes national headlines, generates a massive backlash to the America First Committee, and criticism from across the board. Just to give you a couple of examples, the morning after the speech, so again, immediately, September 12th, 1941, the Des Moines Courier, so the local paper there in Des Moines, Iowa, is going to say, hey, look, even if we give Charles Lindbergh the benefit of the doubt and say he had the best intentions, that he was just being honest about what he thought and he wasn't trying to malign anyone, even if we do all of that, then he's just an idiot. Then we just shouldn't trust him. We can't trust him with leadership. We can't trust him to make policy decisions, right? And that is if we put the best face on him. Other critics, including the White House, were willing to speak a little bit more bluntly. I should say, as far as I know, Roosevelt himself never addressed the speech in any way. But his press secretary would basically accuse Charles Lindbergh of disseminating Nazi propaganda. This speech would come to define the America First movement for the remainder of its existence. They refused to divorce themselves from Charles Lindbergh or to condemn the speech in any way. They kept him on as a speaker for the remainder of the committee's existence. Their defense was to say, look, we're still not anti-Semitic, but we don't think this speech was anti-Semitic. We think Charles Lindbergh was not making comments, directed at Jews as a race, but speaking of them as like a political group or something like this. And so it's not anti-Semitism in the way that you mean it. This did not convince a lot of people in the American public, again, who continue to regard this as an anti-Semitic organization. As I said, they kept Lindbergh on until the very dissolution of the committee. So the sign you're seeing on screen now is for a planned rally for December 12th, 1941. But of course, the committee would shut its doors on December 11th. So again, kind of continuing commitment to defending Lindbergh and his comments came to define this organization as primarily an anti-Semitic organization. Which brings us back to where we started, which is at the end. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor is attacked. Almost immediately, the committee begins plans to dissolve. Again, within 4 days, they've basically shut down the entire operation. Several of their members actually go on to join the U.S. military and fight in World War II. And so, it looks like for this moment, that kind of idea of America Firsterism, first of all, had been a completely failed political movement at every step of the way, despite generating these kinds of responses and public outreach. The Neutrality Acts had been revised again over their objections, right? So as they tried to fight cash carry, they tried to fight Lend-Lease, they tried to fight moving into Greenland, and they lost every single one of these political fights. And tarred the movement by tying themselves too closely to anti-Semites and by being a little bit too friendly with fascists. Again, even though they're removing those fascists from their membership ranks, the reality is that fascists recognized that America First was on their side. And so even as they're saying, hey, we don't want the silver shirts or the Bund to join our ranks, the Bund is saying, please go donate money to America First. The silver shirts are saying you should sign up for your local chapter. And so this becomes the way that we have remembered the America First Committee ever since. And so like I said, until 2016, if you had attended one of my lectures or read any kind of generic American history textbook, this is the dialogue you would have found about it. Of course, it did not die, and that's what we'll hear about over the next 5 weeks with a 1-week break there. So we'll see how these ideas have come back into American life and what they've meant for us in the present moment. But thanks for your time, and I think we'll take a quick break now and then come back for Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Trundle. Let's take, it's 4 o'clock now, let's take no more than 10 minutes. There were some refreshments out in what they call the gathering room behind you, and you can bring the coffee back in to the seats here, and we can resume with the question and answer and comments, and maybe we can generate some discussion. So we'll see you at 10 after 4.
Speaks fast.
And if you're home, do what you want to do.
Fine. They said that people were upset about anti-Semitic comments. But America was anti-Semitic. Roosevelt turned away the St. Louis. The refugees wanted to come to this country. And he was an astute politician. And he knew he was on safe ground. That the Americans would support pushing them away. We didn't want those people. So I don't know why they would be upset if you said something anti-Jewish. Did you have fun out there?
Oh, worry. That's a good word. Great decisions. Great decisions. Oh, yeah. I'm still doing that after you conquer your toast.
I still went back to Europe and I lost my life.
Oh, it's fun.
You were reporting to me
Well,
recently, sorry.
No, I really haven't. I think it
how much
has.
we knew about
Well,
what's really going on.
last year it was pretty disappointing. This year the videos are a little bit better. You know, they must be got more money so they can travel around and interview. Oh,
And they knew at the train stations where they were bringing them. They didn't bomb the train stations because they were concerned about collateral damage. But that would have saved more lives if they had blown up those train stations.
well, some of the same stuff we're talking about here. Isolation
Prisoners
versus
from bombing.
Yeah,
Agreed.
I was thinking the same
Yeah,
thing.
I was thinking we'd probably hear about nationalism versus localism and things of that nature.
Well, that and the Supreme Court case that they're arguing right now has nothing to do with this. This is the American First was against the Chinese. After they built the railroads, we didn't want them anymore. Well, get them out of
That's
here.
true. Well, yeah.
Email first every day, read it all the way through. Well, I appreciate the compliment. Never told you that, I guess. And I skip an awful lot of emails. I do and read. I'll probably delete 300 emails.
Let's talk to Walt. I'm talking Walt. I keep saying to people, we've seen how before. Why are we doing this again? And I work, so I'm laying home at night and crying. We are doing it again. It's not gonna change anything. It took us a while to get here. It took us a long time to get around this script. I'm worried that we'll have an election in November and it won't be enough. Yeah, he's got, that guy's, he's trying his best to declare martial law. We're not having an election.
People really do, they're catching on to that now.
Well, if we don't have votes, there isn't a reason to be here, right? Yeah, no, yeah.
That's okay.
politically, socially active, you know, so I just love the protest music. And that's what actually my paper was about, is that the researchers realized that this protest music is right what's going on with the liberation movement. None of them talk about pen at all. Why do I do themselves?
would be nice for him to do a class.
Oh,
You know, like 3 or 4 weeks worth. I'm not sure what, but
I might rewatch that again.
you know, I thought the same thing. In fact, yeah, right. Well, part of my problem was when he was speaking, I was also trying to read,
Yeah.
and I'm too old to do 2 things at once.
And also they were passing around this.
Oh yes,
That
yes,
was-
the registry. Yeah, it was
I
distracting.
kind of because I had to pass it to this person and then
Yeah,
I had to
yeah,
go back.
yeah.
And they shouldn't have done it.
Yeah, well, but it was, yeah, it was really good. It was interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, it was really good.
So that's what you're gonna put actually in here. Not left in the corner should be.
I just want to show you this one. I think this is a picture Bill Clinton wrote.
That's probably one of the tamer ones. He probably got it.
Yeah. New York Times.
You can use it actually in your garage. 5 o'clock is
Thank you. Question. What do you think of Rachel Maddow's book? You seen something similar to the trailer? Where have you seen it?
Actually, I haven't read it. Okay, did you like it? Or I loved it? I read her bit about it.
What's with you, Mark?
Oh, I was reading about that skier that broke her leg.
I know. It was an Fulbright kind of a Arabacter. You know, after a while, I wonder if they didn't work together for health crisis. That's eventually. Yes, especially.
Okay, let's reassemble. We have close to about 20 minutes. This is the time for questions and comments and whatever else you'd like to say. Anybody have anything to say? I'll bring this microphone around so we can get the benefit of the sound. Rick, go ahead.
So thank you very much. It's great information. Oh God, if I could remember it all.
Put the microphone much closer to
But
you.
what I would want to say is on one of your very first slides you put up nativism is a positive thing. But what does that mean? Because when I think about nativism, I'm thinking mostly about Native Americans or Canadians, and you mean mostly white Europeans, right? And males.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Thanks for the question. And just to clarify, I did not mean to list any of those as positive ideas. I was just highlighting that these have been associated with America First. Yeah, nativism, in this context, I do really appreciate the question. I think in an early draft, I spent some time clarifying it. I was trying to cut down for the same time. When we talk about nativism, this has nothing to do with Native Americans. That's not what we mean. This term, particularly in the 19th century United States, although historians will use it to refer to any period, was about, quote unquote, Native Americans, but not indigenous people. They meant people born in the United States, and really they meant white Christian people in the United States. And nativism is just the idea that the needs and values of those people, again, native-born Americans, should be prioritized above anyone else, foreigners, immigrants, non-white people, et cetera, et cetera. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah, it was a prominent movement across the 19th century, and then we still use the ism term just to refer to it continuing in the 20th century.
Okay, we have a couple of questions from folks at home. Jason will read the
Yep.
question.
All right, so we have a question from Ross Larson. Question here is, there were dozens of members of the U.S. Congress that were literally on Hitler's payroll, but they weren't part of the America First movement? Question mark.
Oh, is that a question?
Yeah.
I can't speak directly to the question being on the payroll, but I can say that there were sympathetic politicians, that is to say isolationist politicians who supported the position of America First. Some of them more notable firebrands than others, like particularly a guy named Hiram Johnson is a really prolific isolationist across the period who would not join the committee formally, but would regularly speak at their events and this kind of thing. Yeah, I don't know if that's exactly an answer to the question, but there were not a lot of sitting politicians in the committee, even though they worked to build those kind of convivial relationships, let's say, with politicians.
I have another one coming in from a person by the name of Bill Bonke. People who think put America first is patriotism. Is the reason Samuel Johnson said patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel?
Yeah. So, I'll come back actually to kind of what I said here at the beginning. I think it is very much the ambiguity of the term, the way that it can be interpreted and reinterpreted of America First that has given it this kind of lasting life in American politics. It's the reason it continues to kind of resurface. And I would say, patriotism, similarly, when we abstract it enough, right, can mean very different things to very different people. Does it mean that you fight in a war and serve your country? Does it mean that you protest for civil rights, right? Either one of those might be regarded as a kind of patriotic activity, but depending on where you are on the political spectrum, it probably means one of those and not the other, right? I would suggest there's a kind of similar ambiguity and flexibility there, where that term can get kind of mobilized as a political weapon, right? Even the suggestion America first means that you're accusing other people of putting America second, right? One thing I didn't necessarily get into too much here is, but this debate between the isolationists and the interventionists in the run-up to World War II, both of them are saying, both sides of this conflict are saying, what we want is peace. Both sides advocating around these neutrality acts are saying, we're trying to keep America out of the war and we're trying to keep America safe. But the America First crowd is making a kind of implicit accusation that the interventionists are selling out the United States somehow. And just to maybe clarify that a little bit, for the isolationists, right, the America First, they're saying I think I explained this in the talk, but if we continue to involve ourselves with Britain, it will drag us into this war and it will jeopardize our own defense. The interventionists, Roosevelt and his political allies, are saying the reason we're supporting Britain is to keep this conflict in Europe and to stop Hitler there so that the US doesn't end up having to fight in a war, right? And so, again, there's this kind of flexible meaning of these terms. What does it mean to support peace? Well, yeah, maybe everybody supports peace, even if there's these radically different visions of what would actually lead in that direction.
Okay, this series traditionally offers a global perspective, an international perspective. There's America First. I know you're not really prepared to address this, but can you relate the America First movement to movements in other countries, either now or historically?
No. Here's what I'll say very quickly. I'm a little bit reluctant to address this. I am an Americanist. It is where my expertise is, and I always feel a little uncomfortable stepping outside of that.
We all do it.
Yeah. But I will make the direct connection here actually to Nazism. And what I'll say is that, you know, those American fascist groups I mentioned, the silver shirts, et cetera, at least in their eyes, they were trying to duplicate this hyper-nationalist patriotic movement in Germany, right? So they were actually kind of drawing inspiration from a similar kind of movement. Yes, yeah.
Okay, Councilman Schob.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation so far. I'm going to go back to you started with how it ended. Did it end or did it just wane? And do we need another national rallying cry to cause it to wane again? How would you suggest?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I had some longer comments here that I trimmed down a little bit for the sake of time. So here's what I'll say. I think, you know, I was poking a little fun at these early historians, 1950, 1953, and saying they'd kind of prematurely declared this dead. In the world of 1950 and 1953, I think it was fair to believe that the trends associated with America First, maybe not that they had been defeated, but they had been suppressed and were gone. And you know, what I mean by that is, for example, the kind of isolationist impulse. By 1953, America is well into the Cold War, and you can't run for national office without endorsing some kind of American military presence on the world stage, including defending Europe. The anti-Semitism associated with the America First Committee, you know, the late 1940s and early 1950s, partially in response to the horrors of the Holocaust, saw a wave of movements in the United States for interfaith tolerance and dialogue, sometimes from the federal government, sometimes from churches and community groups, but encouraging religious tolerance across the board. Even, you know, questions about nativism and immigration. This is a period, the 1950s is a little early for this, but they're starting to soften those ethnocentric immigration laws that were passed in the 1920s, the Johnson-Reed Act, which, you know, imposed a national quota system. They're not going to do away with it until the mid-1960s, right? But they are clearly moving in that direction. And so, again, for those historians in 1950 or 1953, I can understand why they would think this movement was dead, right? Having said that, I think looking at this long-standing presence in American history, there are times when these ideas, and again, it is a kind of loose cluster of ideas that sometimes move in different directions, right? Nativism versus isolationism, et cetera. But these ideas can go underground. They might be suppressed. They might have more political prominence at some times than others. But I think an honest look at the last 200 years suggests they never go away, right? What do you do with them? How do you respond to them? It's maybe a larger conversation, but I think it is clear that they will be with us for the foreseeable future. Does that address your question? Yeah.
Okay, there's another question online.
Yeah, the question here is, how distinct was America First from all the Bund and German cultural clubs that flourished across America?
Yeah, great question, and you know, pretty distinct is the answer. There's sometimes significant overlap in the membership, but you know, as I suggested in the talk, the committee itself would actually disavow anyone who was a member of the Bund, or even a member of the German-American National Alliance. And at one point, they also removed a kind of, again, at the request of B'nai B'rith, the Jewish-American group, they removed a whole group of members of the America First Committee who were part of a German-American Veterans Association, this kind of pro-Nazi organization. So again, they did try really to distinguish themselves, to say this is not us and we're not part of this pro-Nazi movement. Not always perfectly, and like I said, this was going in one direction only. That is to say, you know, the America First Committee was trying to keep openly Nazi groups like the Bund, try to keep them at arm's length, but the Bund was telling their membership to donate to America First, to show up to their rallies. William Perry told his silver shirts directly to go ahead and enroll in America First, even when they were saying fascists aren't allowed, right? Certainly the fascists thought America First was on their side, even as, probably for political reasons, the committee was trying to draw a line in the sand to separate themselves.
Okay, a new member of our committee, Becca, who just joined, will have a question.
In the context of with American religious history, I'm always interested to see how things split, especially you talked a little bit about the Catholic Reverend. Catholicism is very global versus more American grown religions like Mormonism or Southern Baptist. Is there sort of a divide with who was more American first, what church leaders say, just kind of general thoughts about that?
It's a great question, and I don't have a good answer for you. Like I said, there was certainly a lot of Coughlinite support for America First. The problem with attaching that to a specific religious faith is that while Charles Coughlin was a Catholic priest, again, he had this radio show and attracted people from kind of different religious walks of life. And so not all kind of adherents to that movement were themselves Catholic. Briefly, I will say that it's I don't have a scientific analysis here prepared for you, but it's clear from looking at the activities and the rhetoric of America First that it was a Christian movement. Like I said, there was this effort to kind of do some outreach to Jewish Americans, but it very quickly fell apart and kind of backfired on them. But in terms of interdenominational support, I'm a little more reticent to wade into like what a census might have looked like, except to say that certainly there was strong Catholic and Protestant support. But if you want to get into minoritarian sects like Mormonism or Latter-day Saints or Jehovah's Witnesses, I would be much more reluctant to take a guess. That's all I'll say.
We have a question or a comment here from Dave Forsyth.
Yeah, some people might be inclined to trace the roots of the American First Committee all the way back to George Washington and his talk about avoiding entangling alliances. In history and also today, hasn't there been some confusion between isolationism and unilateralism? And not historians, of course, but others maybe confuse that term, and separating that might give us more insights into President Trump, who tends to be a unilateralist, but not an isolationist.
Sure. So just to address the first part of your question there, does this trace back to George Washington? I'm going to give you a non-answer and just say, in the eyes of the committee members, they definitely traced it back to George Washington. And I don't want to flip back through all these slides, but if you look at the pictures of Lindbergh speaking, there's always a picture of George Washington behind him. This is very common at the America First rallies. So for for the folks involved in this movement, they certainly trace that historical link all the way back to the founding. And to not even just George Washington, but ideas about the Monroe Doctrine, and the sense that Europe was this other sphere of influence, and we didn't need to concern ourselves so much with what happened over there, as long as we had kind of control of the Americas and this sphere. I don't know if I remember the second part of your question. I apologize.
It's just about the difference between
unilateralism and isolationism. Yeah, so like I said, even applying this term isolationism, in the context of the 1920s or 30s is kind of this long-running issue for historians. It is what people at the time, it is the term people at the time used to describe this kind of particular cluster of political ideas, specifically that we needed to stay out of Europe. In a kind of formal sense, I'll leave it to the political theorists and political scientists to make that distinction more cleanly. But I think what you're pointing to is this question of whether do you act on your own, unilateralism, or do you withdraw from the world stage, right? Isolationism, cut yourself off. I don't know in the world of the 1920s and 30s if that distinction was clear. And again, here I would sort of harken back to the fact that even these isolationists, the people we call isolationists, are completely supportive of military action in Latin America. The continuing occupation of the Philippines is going to go through the end of World War II, right? So they're not talking about pulling back to American borders, if that's what we mean by isolationism. But they are talking about a resistance to acting through international institutions, right? Not joining the League of Nations, not quote unquote giving up our sovereignty to some kind of multilateral treaty, right? Reserving the right to act independently in a unilateral fashion. I don't know if that helps address your question.
Okay, something from John Weil?
Not really a question, but a point of information to the first question that was asked. In her podcast series prequel, Rachel Maddow educated me about members of Congress back in that time period who would read messages that were favorable to America First into the congressional record and then use their government-paid postage to send out messaging and pamphlets to spread that word.
Jason, do we have somebody else online?
Oh, sorry, I forgot I could say one thing really quick, just to expand on that a little bit. This came up, somebody asked me something similar in the hallway. And I hesitated around speaking to sitting politicians and their involvement. But one case I did mention to the folks, somebody who had asked me outside, was that the America First Committee did work with Laura Ingalls, not Laura Ingalls Wilder, totally different person, who was an aviator, but also literally on the Nazi payroll. But it doesn't seem like the committee actually knew that at the time. In fact, it doesn't seem like anyone knew that at the time except for her and whoever her handlers were. So, again, certainly there is this comedy, right? This friendship between pro-Nazi sentiment and the America First Committee, mitigated by layers of plausible deniability, right? If you're openly a fascist, we'll remove you from the rolls. If you come to our meetings and you talk about how evil Jews are and how we should have a stronger military defense and close our borders and suspend civil rights laws, espouse a bunch of fascist ideals, well, you can keep coming to the meeting, right? We're not going to kick you out from that. So as long as you're not, again, officially a card-carrying member of these organizations, you are welcome at the AFC.
Okay, we have something from Barry Marchand.
Getting back to Benny's question a little bit ago, what kinds of political and social activities were successful in countering the America First agenda back in the 20s and 30s?
I don't want to read too much into your question, but are you sort of asking because you're thinking about what folks might do today? Is that?
Yes.
Well, here, I'm afraid my answer is going to be some bad news for you, which is that, when I look at this contest between the interventionists and isolationists, I think it's undeniable that part of the reason the interventionist movement ultimately was successful was because the president was on their side. I don't know that that's going to be the case today in terms of the question you're asking. Again, major press figures were on their side. There's a kind of united front between basically every publishing organization. Hearst, New York Times, Washington Post, Time Life, right? We're all advocating interventionist ideas. So, there were these kind of ready-made institutions and organizations which were stepping in to defend democracy and kind of promote this vision, this internationalist vision of the United States. And again, I don't know that we're going to find that today. With that caveat out of the way, it is also the case that citizens took it upon themselves to challenge these ideas. That Committee to Defend America and its Allies that I mentioned, again, organized speaking circuits, published their own pamphlets and literature. The Friends of Democracy, right, the Unitarian minister, I think Weld is his last name, I'm forgetting for the moment, right? He started his own organization and started publishing. There may be some open questions about how much impact any of these things had, but certainly, again, ordinary people, civic groups, institutions, churches, were wading into this fight and speaking out. And it's hard to believe that they didn't make some kind of difference, right? Given the kind of scale of that mobilization.
We have time for one more question before we turn into pumpkins. Okay, well, with that, thank you, Dr. Trundle, for a very illuminating talk and very good response to the questions. We'll see everyone next week at 3 o'clock, the same time, where we're going to have a speaker on the economic aspects of America First, professor from the College of Business at the university. So we'll see you then. Thank you.
You got that craft for 3, right?
Yeah,
Taco. Yeah.
what we've been talking about.
Finally, yes.
See you next week.
I'll be here.
I'll be here.
Excellent program. Thank you. Thank you. Got good things here.
You gonna watch the Super Bowl?
My son wants to. I'll be there. That's a good plan. You're welcome.
You also, we'll see you next week. Thanks for coming. Thank you very much for having us.